Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I'm Joel A. Erickson. I'm joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. We don't know really what to talk about with matchups. Just full disclosure, the Titans robbed all the entertainment from this game for a neutral watcher because Will Levis isn't in it to do weird things. So,
unless you're into a bunch of Christmas puns with Rudolph, it's not a lot to play up with that matchup.
Yeah, there's not a lot to get into with the matchup. I think you guys we got pretty into where the Colts stand after the Denver game. Plus, the other thing is, honestly, from what I've seen, most people aren't talking about the Titans game. They're talking about the future. And so we're going to try to do a little bit of future projecting on the podcast. I know what everybody's asking about. I don't know if we have answers on it, but I think we can talk through some of this stuff. We're going to go through the three pillars of the organization who could go somewhere. So, Nate, I'll let you lay out who those guys are.
Well, one's Luke Rhodes. I'm just kidding. Yeah. Three pillars, the three most important people. It's not the long snapper, no offense to Luke Rhodes, who is a really good long snapper. Anthony Richardson, Chris Ballard, Shane Steichen. It's interesting to talk through those three just because it's we're here almost at the end of this season, and I think there's still a lot of debate as to how entrenched any of them are or should be, or should they all be a package deal, or is there a way to move on from one and not the others? That's I think that's probably what everyone's kind of getting into, and the idea that it's weird that two of them are on the same timeline. It's a lot of what we'll get into is deciding on the three of them is complicated because two of them are in the exact same timeline and have been conjoined at the hip. Anthony Richardson, Shane Steichen, they're either going to lift each other up or pull each other down, and we've kind of seen mixes of both of that these past 2 years. And then the other one, Chris Ballard, is in year 8 as a general manager, and so it's they chose to have these kind of mix and match timelines by keeping a GM and having him find these other two. And it kind of leaves a lot of things up in the air right now because it's not as simple as the Lions, for example. When I was there, was kind of that was the first year Matt Patricia, but then when they cleaned house on that staff, they cleaned house all the way through. 3 new pillars all at the same time with Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes, and Jared Goff. And so when they were in year 2, it kind of went in the reverse order how this Colts first 2 years with Shane Steichen's gone. Where the first year for the Lions, they won 3 games, then they won 9 games the next year, but they missed the playoffs. I think everyone was on board with keep this thing going because the whole group was new. I think there's a lot of debate and different ideas with the current 3 pillars of the Colts, just because one of them we're judging 8 years of a body of work, and then the other 2 we're trying to get a read on first-time head coach, 22-year-old quarterback. They haven't had a ton of games together, but things move fast in here. And we talked about, I think you said on Sunday that all of this has transpired has sped up the timelines or sped up the evaluation. And I guess this podcast is kind of proof positive of that. We're already evaluating that here and running even to the end of the season yet.
Yeah, it's the thing that sparked it for me was I had to stop at my wife's school on the way to the Colts facility today to drop off something that she needed for teaching. And one of the people who works in the office there that I know ran out of the office to be like, what's going to happen? Which I understand. I understand the question. It's the thing everybody's talking about. So that's kind of what sparked it for me. I want to start with Richardson. I think we'll start with Richardson. He's the one that we're getting the most feedback on, I think, right now, and the one we have to do the least amount of projection on as far as what goes on behind the scenes. So I think we'll start with that. There's a lot. I already wrote a lot about this, so I'm just going to lay out what I wrote in my column the other day and then let you kind of go. There's a lot to like about Anthony Richardson. He avoids sacks. His legs are very dynamic. He flashes the ability to make the kind of NFL throws that we saw. There were 2 on the first couple drives the other day that were just great. But overwhelmingly, this passing game, it just has not been good enough. The early on, we talked about, the the big plays were making up for the inconsistency and inaccuracy because his yards per attempt were good. His yards per attempt have fallen. He's at like 6 since he came back from the benching. It's just not consistent enough. And that, I don't think that necessarily leads to the point where I'm like, I don't generally, we'll just start out this podcast by saying this. Nate and I are not really, it's not really our job to call for anybody else's, to call for their jobs. Just isn't. And the reason has nothing to do with, I know people like to talk about us getting access. The reason has nothing to do with that. I think the reason is if a beat writer does that, it sounds like we're cheering for something to happen. It's not a good place to be in. So we're not really supposed to think that way. But the question of when to decide whether or not Anthony Richardson can ever make this leap as a passer is the important one. And right now, I think this is where I'm going to leave it to you after this. Right now, it's just not good enough as a passer. The question is, how much time do you want to give him to find out if he can do it or not?
Yeah. He is still only 14 games in. So it's sort of like when we got to the end of year 2, if you had told me that like in the beginning, you'd like to think that we are kind of at that point where we feel like we somewhat know. Usually 2 years in, you should have a decent idea. It's been such a weird road to get here for so many different reasons. The shoulder injury last year, missed a couple games injury this year, missed a couple games because they chose to bench him for a couple games. So it's shrunk. And so it, like everything that he has done in those 14 games kind of speaks loudly, and we're trying to react to it because the literal time is the same. We're at the end of year 2. And if they're going to start to make decisions on these others pillars, then this guy's right in the center of it. So for Anthony, I mean, I kind of agree with how you laid that out. It's just such a mixed bag where, like, if you want to talk yourself into the talent and the upside and the tools, those are there. It isn't. There's sometimes guys have played in this league at quarterback that you get this far in and you just think, like, you just haven't seen it at all. It's not that you haven't seen it consistently, you haven't seen it at all. You haven't seen those traits. I think about a guy like Kenny Pickett. I think within 2 years with the Steelers, you could see there wasn't a lot of. I think everyone there talked about kind of his late game leadership was sort of the best selling point, but there weren't physical traits. Like Josh Rosen, I think that one was pretty clear early on that like the physical tools weren't going to be good enough, special enough. Like, so with Anthony, it's not a matter of that. When he still leads the league in yards per completion, which is both a good and bad stat for him, because the good part is, I mean, obviously that means he has gotten a lot of chunk plays. The bad part is he doesn't get a lot of completions. I mean, he's 47% on the season, and 8 of his 10 starts, he's been at 50% or worse. So that's tough. The only times he's been over 50%, one of the games shouldn't really count. He was 3 of 4 against the Steelers. And then the one where he actually hit a lot of completions, that first game back from the bench against the Jets, he was 20 of 30. But overwhelmingly, the player we see is a superb athlete who runs the ball very well, productive runner when he runs the ball, gets out of sacks at an incredible rate, does not translate that ability yet into completions. Just finding completions is hard, and then he's turning it over more than you want to see. 7 touchdowns, 11 picks. And so it depends on what you're looking for. If you want to make a case either way, you have it with Anthony's body of work. If you want to say, hey, there's traits to develop here, and whether it's injuries or the benching or supporting cast or just how young he is, he hasn't yet gotten a full chance to do that. You could point to a lot of highlight moments in his rushing numbers and the sack avoidance to make that case. If you're also ready to move on and you're saying, hey, I just don't see enough kind of consistency from him in terms of his kind of the way he carries himself versus the way that he plays quarterback, the way that he throws, you can make that case too. It's sort of like going into next year. Like so I do think these final 3 games are very important. They're most important for him, more important than Shane or Ballard, Chris Ballard, is that these are 3 games Anthony gets to use to show something more than what he's shown so far as a passer. And so if he can go final 3 games over 50% completions and the turnovers are down and you'd like to get to a point where you say, hey, since he came back from the benching, it's just been one bad game against the Broncos because the other three were pretty good. New England wasn't great, but it was clutch, like game winner. So you'd like to be able to say, hey, like wherever that is, 6 of the final 7 games since the benching were pretty good. If you're in that spot, then I think you're pretty encouraged going into next year. If the next 3 games are more like what we just saw in Denver, that's where it gets, you're just kind of running on blind faith into next season. So this is one that is the biggest thing I'm looking for in these final 3 games is same place we started this season, which is evaluating Anthony and his growth. And like, it's late in the year. So you're like, it's go time for him to, these final 3 games show that like there are strides as a passer, because we know what he is as a runner. We know what he is avoiding sacks, but can you give us a few signs that like you're seeing and processing and making good decisions and delivering somewhat catchable balls these final 3 weeks? I think that would go a long way to give you encouragement to want to give it another year.
A couple of pieces that he mentioned today when we were talking to him that I think are the right places for him to be looking at in terms of improvement. One of the things he said was it's not just about his ability to avoid sacks, it's about finding people after he does that. That's been sort of a consistent issue, I think, is he breaks the pocket, but it turns into, we talked about this on Sunday night. If you've listened to the previous podcast, it was Monday or Tuesday for you. But, once he breaks the pocket, instead of turning it into a 0-yard play with an incompletion, turning it into positive yards. He talked about that today as being the next step for him. And that really is like the guys who are really escapable, who are known for their escapability in the pocket, like the really good ones. I think the one that comes to mind is always Roethlisberger. There's probably other people, but he's the one that's kind of known for throwing people around and then making a play. That's the thing, is they have to make the play after it. And Richardson seems to understand that. Another one that he mentioned was not going downfield all the time, sometimes taking the shorter route. He mentioned that Shane Steichen has tried to not dial up so many home run threats. I think if you watch the tape of the games, you're going to see some receivers running open underneath when they take maybe less high percentage throws downfield. I think that's something else he can work on in terms of getting his accuracy up, and not just getting his accuracy up for the sake of accuracy, but getting completions that move the chains. I used to cover the Saints. Drew Brees was sort of famous for this, but like he always used to say you can't go taking a profit when it came to checking down to the running back or making a short throw or living to 2nd down and 6 or whatever. I honestly thought Bo Nix did a poor job of that on Sunday as well. You saw it on both sides of the field. One of the things about, like, you want the big throws, but you have to make the chain movers too. And the Colts go through these times in the games where they're just not moving. They're not getting first downs. And some of that is Shane Steichen. We'll get to him in a second. Some of it is Richardson. I think those are probably areas that stick out to me in terms of passing beyond just the misses of playing quarterback is getting completions. And the other one, when throwing on the move, oftentimes when he throws on the move, he's a little bit less accurate. There were, one going to the right to Pittman, one going to the left to Mitchell, stick out from Sunday's game. Like, this is all stuff that you kind of have to be able to do in the NFL consistently to get that completion percentage up.
Yeah, the throwing on the move, that's ultimately going to be who he is if he works. He's not going to be – I don't think his profile, his makeup is going to suggest a quarterback that will ever be, 65% or better completions. If he ever becomes that, then you got something pretty crazy on your hands. But you look like Cam Newton's career. It was not that, but it was, when he would throw on the move, when he would get out there on the move, it's like if you don't get this guy on the ground, who's hard to get on the ground, then he can really kill you. And I think that's got to become who Anthony is that it's if you can combine those things, because he is so hard to bring down. Like you saw Denver, this is where it's a complicated evaluation. It's like Denver's the best pass rush in the game, and they were just befuddled at the fact that they hit him 10 different times. Only twice did they get him on the ground. But again, it's like he went 17-38. You got to be able to, when you escape like that, that's when like the explosive play should come. And not just because he's going to launch it all as far as he can down the field, but that's because receivers should be breaking open. And so I think some of that is how he's seeing the game and how he's developing with these receivers to know where they're going to be. I think they've worked so much on kind of some of these base plays that another step in this to get better at is the scramble side of that and taking their chemistry to that level. I think that's been hurt by the in and out nature of him getting hurt and getting benched, and some in and out nature of these receivers too, in and out of practice. I think that's taken a toll. And then of course it's a limited group of receivers because they don't have tight ends, but that's kind of beside the point. For him, I think he needs to start to see those routes underneath, see places to go with the ball that are just safer. Like, and if he can throw, like, you can get chunk plays without it all being air yards if you can lead a receiver in the right way. Like, there was a play where that Alec Pierce got hurt on Sunday. It was like that deep post that was like a jump ball. Will Mallory is uncovered right underneath that, and if he hits that, I'm pretty sure, like, I think that was third and really long, but I think they have a chance to convert that, and you stay on the field, and you also kind of develop a rhythm that way. So I think that's what he's got to look at right now. If you're trying to spin this forward, to think about, like, how's he going to take these leaps if he's throwing this way right now? I do think the offseason is the time to work a little bit more work with a throwing coach and overhaul some of those mechanics. That's what Josh Allen talked so much about, that's how he transformed from, it wasn't like he was dramatically better in week 6 than he was in week 2 early in his career. It was getting those each offseason to build on from the previous year to where by the time he was in year 3, that's when he's over 60%, and he was able to become the monster that he is now. Anthony, that's, if you want to tell yourself into giving him the time to do it, that's a big part of it. Is last offseason was a little weird because he's coming off the shoulder surgery. The one before that, he didn't get a true offseason. That was, coming into the draft, training, a lot of training for day and combine stuff. You hope that this can be his first full offseason, normal offseason, do the full, plot it out and get with the throwing coach and develop some of that way. And so if you combine those two things, I think better decisions and better maybe knowing where to go with the ball and choices in terms of hitting that kind of intermediate route over the chunk play. You combine that with better mechanics in the offseason, I do think it still has a chance to be pretty good. But you got to have the time to do that. You have to be willing to commit to the time to do that, which I think that's where it connects to our other pillars and what you do with them as well.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about Richardson over the course of the year. Let's get into Shane Steichen. And some of this goes hand in hand because I think we've heard enough from the players to know that there was maybe a little bit too much big play hunting from Steichen as a play caller earlier. I think some of that, though, is partially in response to what we're seeing now, where they have trouble putting drives together, trying to steer into the lightning bolt of all of it. Whether or not that's the right idea, I don't know. I think at times, this is maybe one of my criticisms of Steichen, it seems like when the offense isn't doing well, he wants to hit the big one to get it back on track. Can't always do that. I'd say from other offensive stuff, I think I've mentioned this before. It's a concern that they don't run the ball well when they don't have the quarterback. That's all tied to the quarterback because as dynamic as Richardson's legs are, there's going to be times when he's hurt. Sometimes you just would rather. I think the running game's better if it's more dynamic with the running back where it doesn't have to be just the pull of Richardson. And what was the other one? I had a third one. I got to figure out what my third one was, but that's two of them. I don't feel like they've handled blitz as well this season.
Yeah.
With either Richardson or Flacco at the helm. I don't feel like they've handled blitz as well this season. Whereas, I think I said this last week, like the guy that was in Denver last week was Peyton. They're doing a great job protecting Bo Nix. Now, maybe they don't have the same offensive line injuries or whatever, but Bo Nix is holding on to the ball forever, and they're doing a great job protecting him all season long, not just against the Colts. So I think those are three things that sort of stick out to me as big picture type issues with the offensive part of it. I think some of the other stuff is a little harder to put my finger on. Like, it's harder for me to know. I think messaging publicly is not great, but what matters more is the messaging within the team. And I think it's really hard for me to put my finger on like where he is in that spot.
Yeah, it is tricky because I think with that stuff, players. I think he talks differently to the players oftentimes than how he talks to the public. That's a lot of coaches are like that. I think he's more extremely like that, and I don't know that this part of him learning this job is understanding that like talking to the public isn't just it's not just to be totally dismissed. It's like it can send a mixed message within your locker room too, and that happened at times during the benching. He's had to grow in some of those ways that he'd never really run into something like that, like a real controversial decision. You think about his career so far, it's been a lot of behind the scenes roles until he was an offensive coordinator. The Chargers, maybe this was a little different. They had, but like it's always been successful. He had Justin Herbert's big rookie year. Then he goes to the Eagles, and once he takes over play calling there, they go to the playoffs and they go to the Super Bowl. And then he had a great first year here. And I think he was not ready to handle messaging and handling controversy. And I think that it's still an area I think he needs to grow in, not just controversy, but like really owning his decisions and explaining them and taking some accountability for those in the moment. He may do it more behind the scenes. That's the thing. We don't know all that, but it's one of those where like if like the A.D. Mitchell play, for example, the decision to pass back to him and all that, like that was, you can blame a few different people for that, but Shane, had a role in it. He said, I own it. I take full responsibility for that. It's like, well, that's where you could explain a little bit more, because if a coach doesn't, then we have to go to the players, and sometimes that ends up being harder on the young players. So there's some stuff like that he's got to grow at. And I think some things are not going to be as much in his strength as the other parts, which is, his main thing is play design and mastering details of X's and O's and being that. So, that's, I guess for me, that's the part that surprised me this year is like, I didn't have much to criticize at all last year. I think that's kind of why I went as hard at the 4th and 1 call against the Texans as I did. It's like that. It was like one of the only times last year to go at something X's and O's related. Again, how much of the regression with him is the fact that he has a very young quarterback who's not as equipped to handle this stuff as mentally as Gardner Minshew was. Certainly that's part of it, but also that's the role that he's in, is to get more out of this kid and get him to that place. And so I don't know. It's been a weird year to evaluate with Shane, because he's not like coming into the year. I didn't have a lot of questions about the thing he was supposed to bring. Like I did have questions about some of the messaging, some of the leadership in tough times, but not the X's and O's and can he work with quarterbacks and get the most out of them. This year that hasn't taken off to the level that I think everyone was hoping and expecting for. So I don't know. You'd like to think it was just just not his best stretch with the benching and all that other stuff, and maybe that's what these final 3 games can do for him too. Is that if Anthony can take off and show a lot of this, it's going to also be because Shane pulled more of that out of him and tailored the game more to his strengths, which was a big point that he had to learn through the benching too. So I guess it's still an ongoing evaluation for him too.
Yeah, I think the point about him dealing with like the first real adversity of his career, once he took a head job, is also true of just like the offense and trying to get it going. This is the first time the offense has really struggled. And, I think the Mitchell call, he said he was trying to give the offense a spark. Now, I've seen others point this out, so I don't want to claim it as my own, but like he said the offense was kind of stagnant. Well, the last couple drives before that 2 were ruined by fumbles. One of them should have been a touchdown. Others were ruined by holding penalties. Like, at least at that point, it was less about what the Broncos were doing and more about what the Colts were doing in terms of shooting themselves in the foot than it was about really needing to spark something. So, that's one of the things that's tough to know. I think with both Steichen and Richardson in a vacuum, and I think we can talk about this for a little bit, and then we'll get into the third person on this list. But with both Steichen and Richardson in a vacuum, assuming that the Colts play well in these final 3 games, if there was nothing else going on with the organization, if it's just those two, I think I would generally lean toward, we said we were going to stick with this young quarterback. This is really his first full season. This is the coach's first full season, coordinating him as an offensive player. Let's see if they can grow when he's got an off season where he can actually throw. He's not hurt with his shoulder, where Steichen has has less theoretical information and more practical information to work with as he builds the offense. I think that would make sense, especially if it ends up being 2 9-8 seasons, because, Shane was hired after the Colts went 4 and 6,500 in 2022.
That fourth quarter in Dallas counted as 17 different losses. So that's
and then the comeback in Minnesota was 6,000. So, in a vacuum, if you're not looking at, if there isn't this other piece that we're about to get to, in a vacuum, a new coach coming in, drafting a super raw quarterback and going 9-8 2 years in a row, you'd probably see that out, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's
keep going.
I was just going to say, and that's the other pillar to this is what muddies the evaluation too, is that they rolled back the same group as last year. And yes, they finished top 10 in scoring last year, but when you're bringing some players back from their best seasons, they're going to not have their best seasons. That's happening at tight end. That whole group's fallen off a cliff, and they've kind of stopped using them, which I think is fine because they're not showing that they should be. That part, I think, of the offense has been, Shane has managed that well, or managed it smartly, because they don't have tight ends to deal with. So early in the year, one of the big moments that was not great for Shane was that speed option call with Trey Sermon in Green Bay. Again, I don't like the speed option, and I don't think you should not run it with. I don't think you should run it with anyone not named Jonathan Taylor anyway. But it's magnified by the fact that his other options are Trey Sermon and Tyler Goodson out of the backfield. And when we talk about how they've handled pressure, part of the issue is your stud all-pro running back can't pass protect. And so then when you want to play a pass protector, you have that in Trey Sermon, but he can't really offer anything else. And that's just become true in a couple different spots. So personnel has played into this and muddied it a little bit, where early in the year it felt like offensive line was in a good place. Certainly in pass pro, you lose Will Fries, who is a tremendous pass protector. And I think some of the depth decisions they've made with that line have hurt them. But there's other things that I put some on Shane as well, which is this team is just so insistent on zone blocking all the time, because I think that's the background of Tony Sparano Jr. And Shane went through this whole process of finding the offensive line style and coach that he really wanted. But I don't know that they've tailored that to the personnel as well as they could have, where I'd like to see more power, more gap scheme blocking with a guy like Quentin Nelson. And also it makes it hard when you run zone, when you do have injuries pop up and guys are in and out. Those are zone is so reliant upon chemistry of those combination blocks and running duo that that makes it hard with injuries. And so then they recognized that. So they started Danny Pinter this past week. And I don't think it was the right decision. I think they should have probably started Tanner Bortolini, but I think they wanted to keep some idea of chemistry with Mark Lewinsky. So I think Shane's personnel decisions, I think, have been not as good as they could have been, whether it's when to play Trey Sermon, whether it's I think you could look at, honestly, they probably, looking back, probably should have put Michael Pittman Jr. on injured reserve. Maybe that's easy to say when, A.D. Mitchell has not stepped up enough to make you feel like you could do that. But then we get into, there have been spots where they've used A.E. Mitchell and put a little bit more on him than maybe I think he's earned so far. So really the personnel decisions, I think, that's kind of where I think Shane has not handled it as well. And that's why I kind of urge the players versus plays is just starting with the players and then finding the plays that fit them, and also not overloading them physically or mentally with stuff that they're maybe not equipped to handle. So I think that's all stuff that, he was better at last season than this year, because last year had a lot of this mix and matching too of guys in and out. I just thought he had a much better grip on kind of what guys were fit to do, what Zach Moss is fit to do versus Jonathan Taylor versus, the way he tailored it to Gardner Minshew. Something's been off with that this year. I don't know if it's just the surprise of when some of these injuries have happened or reading them, or, certainly the difference last year is once they went to Gardner Minshew, it was Gardner like the rest of the way. This year it's been a little back and forth with the quarterbacks, in and out with the quarterbacks, whether it's injuries or the benching. And so I don't know. It's just kind of understanding the players that he has. I think Shane can get better at that, but also some of the players need to be better. Some of the depth options on offensive line, wide receiver, and then find any tight ends or pass catching running backs. I think a lot of this could solve itself if some of those players are better too.
Yeah, well, Gus Bradley factors into this too, because, Chris Ballard said point blank, at the end of last season that he didn't give Gus enough in the secondary. And that was when we were asking about Gus Bradley's job security. Like, you can't get any more serious than that. And then they didn't add anybody. Like, they lucked in, like we were talking about this today, actually, in the media room. Like, you can take credit for identifying Sam Womack, but if the Niners have a couple more injuries, or maybe one more injury in the secondary heading into the regular season, Sam Womack's not available.
Yeah.
And you don't get lucky with that. Like, there is a little bit of luck with that. Like, yes, there's an evaluation on the player and he's got the background in the system and you went out and got him, but he had to be available. And you didn't have a lot behind them. And you've been lucky, honestly, that they haven't been hurt since then.
Oh, yeah. That's just what I was going to add in real quick, is that, it is unfortunate that Juju Brents, for sure, got hurt week 1, even though we knew he's had that history. They're really lucky, though, that Sam Womack and Jalen Jones have not had anything. They've been out there every single snap. And we know what would have happened if they weren't. It would have been Dallas Flowers in there, because they tried to mix and match him a little bit and then cut him, and that was way back in week 5. So I really don't know what they would have done at outside cornerback if either of those guys had to miss any time. So, yeah, that's the unfortunate part. I think, Gus Bradley goes even more that way, is that I criticize how he's used some of these players, but also you just brought back all the same players that weren't ultimately good enough last year. So I don't know that you just put that on the coordinator to get more out of. I don't know. He should be getting more out of some parts of them, but also, defenses regress in this league more than they just get better usually.
There's also a bad pattern with Ballard of betting on guys who've been hurt to stay healthy.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of the secondary story. Julian Blackmon's hurt. He was hurt. He got moved to free safety because in Ron Miles' word, he's got a bad shoulder. We knew that from the Green Bay game. But that's why he's been playing free safety instead of strong. Julian Blackmon, I hate to say this, he's got an injury history. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons that he didn't get much more than a small 1-year deal in free agency. Juju Brents is another one. He's back practicing this week. He's only played 1 game this year. He was supposed to be your number 1 corner on the outside. And his history in the NFL is injuries. It just is. The bet on Dallas Flowers with the Achilles tendons, we've been through this before. He's bet on people coming off of Achilles tendons before, and it's never really worked out right away. It's never really worked out that season.
Yeah.
In fact, it's lingered for several of them. Blackmon coming off of his Achilles tear in his second season. The next year was kind of a lost year for him. Taiwo Dengo's rookie year, for the most part, was a lost year, betting on that one. Eric Fisher was a good run blocker, but not a good pass blocker. Marlon Mack never really returned to being the Marlon Mack he was before that. There's a lot of these. where you bet on injuries that haven't necessarily worked out. And so that's a part of the running it back piece that I don't know if we've gotten into as much. I know we did get into some of it with the corners, but there have been some bets on guys to get healthy who haven't gotten healthy. And that goes back to the beginning of his tenure too. We're just bringing up stuff from this year and from the last couple of years, but that goes back to the beginning of his tenure where, we're going to bet on this guy who's hurt and then it gets hurt again. And there's not a safety net in case that happens.
And also I think that's partly why we urged him to upgrade in add impact players on defense, is it also that improves your depth if the guys who are starting are now backups or they're lower on the rung. Like if Jalen Jones got to be a number 2 corner right now, you could feel differently about him than as your number 1 corner. When he had to go up against Justin Jefferson, it's what happens to 85% of quarterbacks who have to go up against Justin Jefferson versus if that's on the plate of another outside corner, that's different. You could have come into the year where Juju Brents was your number 2, but knowing that he gets hurt, well, Jalen Jones as a backup, then it could have been a little bit more seamless than having to rely on Dallas Flowers in moments and having to go find a Sam Womack. And I think about that as safety too, is that if they had gone out and signed either Quandre Diggs or Justin Simmons to play opposite Julian Blackmon, well, maybe when Blackmon hurts his shoulder in week 2, you can sit him down for more than 1 week. And you've got Nick Cross there to step in and be that backup strong safety. So there's more that they can just add more players. They can add more players who are not rookies, because as we're learning this year with Chris Ballard, he is overall a very good drafter over the years. But nobody hits on all their picks, and they certainly don't hit on all of them in year 1. And this year, relying on the new players to be Latu, and A.D. Mitchell, that has not really elevated things. I'd say Latu has had some flashes, and I think he could be encouraged in the long term. But I would not say he's an upgrade on Samson Ebicom from last year, who had 9.5 sacks. And of course, you didn't plan on losing him, but that was you brought in Latu to be. That was the idea of, hey, we went after Danielle Hunter in free agency. Didn't get him, so we're going to go to a rookie. That always seems to be a rookie is too often the plan to solve some of these things when it doesn't have to be the only way to go about it. So, I just think that if you had part of what's difficult, the evaluation for Gus Bradley, Anthony, I'll put them all in here. Gus Bradley, Shane Steichen, and Anthony Richardson, is I don't think there are enough players in the spots that they need to know that they're the problem. So if you had a really good pass catching tight end and pass catching running back, and Anthony Richardson still is under 50% completions, that's easier to say, hey, this guy is not getting it done, versus how's he supposed to, the flip side right now that we have is how are you supposed to be a high completion percentage quarterback when you don't have those two positions are so critical to your completion percentage. Goes the same way with Gus Bradley, where if you'd gotten him an all pro safety, that position that defines his defense, and they still were a below average defense, you could say, hey, we got you the piece that you said you needed, and we're not any better. That seems like a coach who's plateaued. Versus here we are saying, he's got one hurt safety. They had to move positions of the safeties and then kind of ran everything back from a defense that was kind of limping to finish last season. So that's sort of the spot that they're in. That's why this whole thing is tricky to figure out, have some of these guys shown enough, or is it time to move on? It's hard to know that for sure.
The other thing with Ballard is that he told us at the beginning of the season that he was going to stick to his guns, and if it cost him his job, so be it. And honestly, it's kind of hard for me to handicap this. We've seen less of Jim Irsay than we ever have before so far this season. It's hard to read his mind. I think the one thing that I think is sort of central to this is, there's no way you can say I don't think there's really any way you can say Chris Ballard's been successful enough in 8 years. No division titles, probably 2 playoff berths, unless something miraculous breaks the Colts way here over the Christmas and New Year's holidays. But and people don't like when I do this, but one of the ways to evaluate the NFL when the organization evaluate NFL teams and the organization is maybe giving you a rosier picture of things than what actually exists is just to say how things generally work in the NFL. Generally, when you get rid of the general manager and bring in a new one, he doesn't want to keep the same head coach, and he doesn't have the same ties to the quarterback if the quarterback is not already a superstar. It's just the way it is. And so, well, I think you could make the case the way the Colts did with Anthony Richardson, where like they bucked stuff. Now, I will say this: this isn't set in stone yet that I was wrong about, being successful once you've been benched, because we're not there yet with Richardson. We don't know that he's actually going to turn into a franchise quarterback. But they're trying to buck that trend. If you try to buck that trend on a larger scale, where you move the general manager and keep the head coach and then the quarterback, you're trying to thread the thinnest of needles. And so I think that maybe the decision is a little harder than people realize, because it's really a decision on three people as opposed to one.
Yeah, I've been in that spot too, where my first year in Detroit, they had brought in a new general manager in Bob Quinn, but they'd kept Jim Caldwell, they kept Matthew Stafford. Now, one of those pieces, like you mentioned, when the quarterback's already established, that's a different thing. Like Bob Quinn took that job to build around Matthew Stafford. That was his team. That wasn't going to change. So that part of it was easier. But we kind of we're on a lookout ever since that season started that, like, at some point the GM's going to want his own guy in there. And they said on and on that, no, they were going to make this work, that he took the job knowing Jim Caldwell was the head coach. He goes 9-7 that first year, and they make the playoffs. They had to put a statement out that he was even coming back because it was such a talking point. They kept him one more year, and then they fired him after that next year. So he still got to that same place that we knew it was going to end up in, which is a GM wants to eventually find his own coach. That seems to happen a lot of these places. It was John Robinson who took over the Titans with Mike Mularkey there. That the same kind of thing happened. Went 9-7, eventually got his own guy. So this, it's messy when you get it to that place. I do think there's a route to making it happen, but it's very thin. It would be if you wanted to keep Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson, but just find a new general manager. I think it would have to be someone who already knows and trusts Shane Steichen. So maybe someone from the Eagles, or maybe someone who's so smitten by Anthony Richardson and also believes in Shane's ability to develop him. Louis Riddick has been one of those guys who's come out and really swung hard in Anthony's defense. You're just trying to find a very specific type rather than, hey, let's go find the best general manager we can. So that's why they feel conjoined here, is that there's a hierarchy to it. The GM is above the head coach, who's above the quarterback, but they're all absolutely central to where this is going to go. And so that's what's strange about this whole thing, is that, like, if these guys were all in year two, you could just make that same case you just said about Shane and Anthony, which is like, hey, we said we were going to give them time. They didn't get the time due to neither their fault year one because Anthony got hurt. This year hasn't been great, but treat this kind of more like his rookie year. You need to see it through and give it into next year. That's a easy case to make for the coach and the quarterback. It's harder with a GM who's in year 8, especially if you feel like part of why we're in this spot is that Chris Ballard kind of kept doing the same thing that he's done for 8 years, which is this draft and develop, don't go after outside names, even when you have positions that really need them. And those are the positions like tight end and pass catching running back that are really hurting, wide receiver depth that are really hurting the evaluation of those other two guys. So it's like, you can bet on Anthony and Shane evolving on some of the points that we've laid out of things they haven't done well, but they're kind of new working together. Chris Ballard, if it's, when he lays out like, I do what I do, and if it gets me fired, so be it, that's kind of a message of like, I'm not going to change. So you have to kind of ask yourself, is this entire model going to work together? And I don't know. It's like, on one hand, I thought there's some parts of Shane and Chris I thought would be a really good match. The fact that Chris has always been kind of knee deep on defense, and Shane is the offensive play design type I thought Shea would bring a little bit of aggressiveness that this franchise kind of needed, that Chris Ballard kind of needed, as he's overly patient with stuff. We saw that a little bit with them trying to trade up in the draft. But then there's the other side where it gets, the other side of that coin where it feels like less of a great fit is when you think about how kind of Chris Ballard's entire team building philosophy is identify cornerstone players you drafted and make those like the stars of the team and not really add around them. Shane this year has been a lot of, trying to use the defensive structure and what the defense is not accounting for and go to that. Those depth pieces, those tight ends, those backup running backs, those secondary wide receivers, those players aren't good enough. Like he's not just riding the players that Chris Ballard has identified and wanted to keep. So I don't know. It's like they have to get on a better page with this, which is like that's what's this entire conversation is kind of coming down to is these three they should be connected, but like I don't know that they've been connected this year, because if they have, I don't think we would have had the benching in the first place, which is I think a big foreshadowing of why we're having this kind of a larger conversation, is that like they introduced doubt in the entire tree just a month ago. And so here we are trying to project forward to see, like, do you keep the whole thing together? Do you split parts of it up? And how much faith do you have in either one of those working? That's kind of the ongoing conversation.
Well, and this was always the danger, I think, of sticking with just firing Frank Reich after the 2022 season. Because obviously that's as bad a failure as you're going to have. I'd say it's even worse than it would be 2017. Because in 2017, your preferred starting quarterback was hurt.
Yeah.
Whereas in 2022, you had your quarterback. They fired Frank Reich. They decided to stick, or Jim Irsay decided to stick with Chris Ballard, saying he's blue chip. I think most people out there know Irsay has always only said glowing things about Chris Ballard. But by sticking with someone who was coming off of that season, who doesn't have the playoff history outside of really honestly Reich, you were putting more pressure on the rest of the timeline. Like you set the organization up to be in this spot where the fan base is admittedly understandably frustrated with the inability to get over the hump. Like this is another thing we probably should have talked about with Shane, but like in 2 years, they don't often beat teams that they shouldn't beat.
Yeah.
Which like that's partially a Ballard thing. It's also partially a coach thing, because teams beat teams they shouldn't beat in the NFL like every week, 2 or 3 times a week sometimes. That was one of the hallmarks actually of Reich's tenure before the 2022 season, was that they had a tendency to, like, just when you thought things were really, really bad, they would beat somebody they had no business beating and it would turn things around. They haven't really done that. And Colts fans are understandably frustrated with that. They want to be like, I get it. You want to be back where you were, where you're a playoff team. They haven't won a division in a decade. Ballard's 8 years are part of that. And like I said, like the decision to not go with a complete reset there puts more pressure on the two people that probably you've been preaching patience with, because the fan base understandably wants results right now. When they made a draft pick on a quarterback because really, we'll get into this later in the offseason, but really I think I'm at the place now where I feel like the quarterback is more important than anything else in team building. So you made this pick, you preach patience, but the lack of success from this regime has put pressure from the outside that you prefer not to be there. It's just kind of a weird, sticky situation.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, like I brought up Detroit as example to this. When they got that entirely new trio in 2021, they brought in, Dan Campbell, head coach, Brad Holmes, general manager, and they traded for Jared Goff. And so the first year they won 3 games. Pretty terrible year, but everyone knew they were purging the roster. It was kind of a whatever year in the end. The next year they started 1-6, and that there was a little bit of tension then, but they finished 9-8. They didn't go to the playoffs though, so they kind of had that reverse of what the Colts are in, where like 9-8 was their second year. So I guess in that way it was like progress, but still people were very into it, even though it's 2 years no playoffs, because they were all in year two. It was all the idea of like they're building this together. Like that's where a GM is able to say, hey, like stick with us, give us time. We're building this. We're moving in the right direction. That's an easy sell to much easier sell to the fan base when you're in year two than year 8. So that's where it was tough. Like this year needed to at least match last year's. Like I thought like the two ways to make this year successful would be, I think they needed to make the playoffs since they were on the doorstep last year, and they needed to get a very promising year out of Anthony Richardson. As of right now, it looks like they're going to be 0-2 on that. So are you able to step back and say, okay, we're 0-2 on that, but the head coach did some really good things the year before. The quarterback has missed a good amount of time. He hasn't really gotten enough time to know for sure what he is. I think you make that argument for both of them. The GM side of that is a lot harder because it's year 8, and I think that's where a lot of fans are. And the apathy and the frustration that you're seeing is not just that they're 6-8 in the year 2024, but it's that they've got 11 years now without winning in this division, and the GM's been here for 8 of those seasons. And so that's all kind of piling up. So it's sort of like this young quarterback and young coach are kind of wearing that pressure of they're here to like lift up a franchise that hit rock bottom in 2022, but rolled back the same defense, same defensive staff, same general manager, a lot of the same roster. Like these guys came here to be like these fixers, but like in some ways they're learning each other. They're learning new roles. Shane had never been a head coach. Anthony Richardson never played in the NFL. He only played 13 starts above college. This is where we're kind of seeing this thing get mangled, and where this was the risk, like you said, they took when they didn't do the full reset, is that even though it is just year 2 for this specific trio, it's not year 2 for all 3 of them. It's year 8 for one of them and year 2 for 2 of them. And how do you compare the 3 when they need to be compared and conjoined? That's tricky.
Yeah. These last 3 games, I think for fans, I don't think they move the needle, even if they win all 3. I think it's pretty hard to handicap what the only person in the world who matters on this decision is thinking.
That's the hardest part about it, is that like we have always gotten indications in prior seasons. Like I remember I got here in 2021, and we know how that it was awesome, and then it totally collapsed. But it was pretty clear not long after that season ended that Carson Wentz was on the outs, that was going to be the guy they blamed. It was pretty clear 2022 that Frank Reich was in danger early in that season, and it was also getting clear toward the end of the season that Chris Ballard was not in the same spot, that he was not going to be in danger, because we heard from Jim Irsay. We're not hearing anything from him. I would venture, I don't know all the reasons why. Of course, we know he's gone through some health issues. He's been just quieter in general over the past year, whether things were good or not good. In general, I don't think it's probably the best sign that he's this quiet as far as the job security of everybody. Usually when he has something to say, it's to kind of double down on something. But I don't know. That's what we're going to have to read. And I do think these final 3 games, they won't matter. So they're not going to matter. It's not going to change the fans' mind about the general manager. The roster's not going to change. I think it can change some minds about where you are with Shane and Anthony, as far as do they show growth and have 3 good games together and are able to package the benching as a positive versus just another blip in a otherwise not super successful season. I do think it will be interesting, though, if they lose one of these home games and the crowd is very sparse, if that affects things with the owner, because that's usually when change happens, it's when owners fear like that apathy is set in with the fan base. and that they're just not. They can deal with anger, angry fans or impatient fans, but apathetic fans, that tends to be something that can affect kind of how an owner feels about where his leaders on the franchise are. So that I'm going to be a little bit tuned into.
Yep. It's the thing everyone's going to be talking about regardless of what happens the rest of the way. We'll be monitoring it. This is going to be it for us for this week. We'll be back for the Colts Cover-2 podcast on the First Impressions edition later. And later this week, and we'll figure it out. We'll figure out where they stand after this game against the Titans. Honestly, of the last three, this is the hardest one because the Giants and Jaguars are dumpster fires without starting quarterbacks. I guess the Titans don't really have a starting quarterback too, do they?
No, but they've got a guy that's.
I'm so upset that we don't get to watch Will Levis, and the reason is simple. In a game between one team that's completely on the outs and one team that's hanging on for it by its fingertips, like if you want something entertaining, Will Levis being an absolute wild card on what he might do on any given snap, that would have been entertaining. Mason Rudolph, like we've seen Mason Rudolph before. It's kind of boring.
Yeah. Well, I do think it is the hardest of the three remaining games also because it's directly off what just happened last week and the gut punch that was the playoff standings. So how does this team respond? Shane Steichen said, well, our motivation is to go out there and beat the Titans at home. We'll see how that sinks in with everybody if they bring that. I remember don't like to make comparisons to 2022, but do you remember they came so close to beating Jalen Hurts and the Eagles, like literally the last play of the game, or just about the last play of the game, they lost on that quarterback draw, and that was sort of like they felt, I think, like 4-7-1 at that point. And the next week, they just completely came out flat against the Steelers, like just zero energy, and they almost came back and won that game. It's sort of like that was like them feeling like our season's not going to go the way we don't have a good lane to the playoffs anymore. This is its own test of that. Not nearly the same chaos around them, but the gut punch that was losing the game the way they did in Denver. How do they come out this week? So that's something to at least be somewhat interested in. Same thing with the crowd. Is there much of a crowd? It's not been a big home field environment this year with a lot of road fans have packed Lucas Oil Stadium. This week, I don't think we'll see that from the Titans, but curious to see how engaged the fan base is after they also suffered the gut punch. So it's just sort of a week to reassess where they go from here.
I am actively trying to erase all 2022 pieces from my memory, all of them.
You and many others.
I like it when it feels like they exist only in a dream, like I dreamed that whole season.
It's a long nightmare.
It was a very long nightmare. Anyway, for the Colts Cover-2 podcast, I'm Joel Erickson. This has been Nate Atkins. We apologize that we can't be sunnier as we head into the holiday season, but it's overcast outside, and it's overcast after the loss to the Broncos. Merry Christmas, everybody.